Hey guys, FilthyRobot here, bringing another guides, tips, and tricks video. This time we're going to be talking about the orc units. Not the heroes, just the units. We'll do heroes in another guide video, but we're going to be doing a breakdown of each of the units here. As with all the unit guide videos, I need you guys to know about 3 different concepts to begin with. The first of these is armor, like the different armor types and damage types in the game. The second is how melee works in this game, and the third is how heavy cover in this game works. So, how does armor work? There are 2 types of armor in this game. There are normal armor and heavy armor. There are 3 types of damage in this game: normal damage, armor piercing damage, and true damage. The way it works for each of those combinations: normal damage attacking normal armor is full damage. Normal armor attacking heavy armor only does 22% of the damage. So you only do 0.22 modifier of the damage you do normally. Armor piercing rounds attacking a normal target only do 40% of their damage, and armor piercing rounds attacking a armored structure, a heavy armored structure, do full damage. True damage does 100% damage to either type. What this means is you want a normal unit attacking normal armor, you want an armor piercing unit attacking heavy armored units, and you want a true damage unit attacking whatever the hell it wants to attack. If you're doing any other types of attacks, you're losing damage types. In general, buildings are heavy armor, vehicles are generally heavy armor, and most units are not heavy armor, although there are some exceptions to that. So you get a rough idea of how those work out. Okay, the second thing is melee. When a unit enters melee, it applies a snare on the other target. It reduces the speed of the target it's attacking temporarily. There seems to be some sort of internal cooldown on this. I don't think if you send 3 squads against the same squad, I'm pretty sure that only the first one provides that snare. And certainly the same squad, you can't just tell your melee squad to leave melee for a second, then re-enter. That won't reapply the snare instantly. There seems to be some sort of cooldown, internal cooldown on that. But the first melee squad that you send against an opposing squad will temporarily slow that squad. So it allows melee to chase ranged in a way that wouldn't be possible otherwise. Okay, and finally, heavy cover in this game. Cover is an all or nothing in this game, and units inside heavy cover are immune. Once you've captured heavy cover, it takes a couple seconds to capture it, but once you've captured heavy cover, external single target damage doesn't do any damage. So range damage outside of the heavy cover doesn't do any damage. So those are just the 3 things we kind of need to pay into attention. So to attack something in heavy cover, you either need to AoE it with something like a flamer that will do damage to the shield, or you need to attack it with melee, and that will just enter the shield and will still do damage to the units inside of it, whereas range damage will just slowly do damage to the shield without doing damage to the units inside that shield. Okay, we've got those concepts under control. Let's go take a look at the orc units in the codex. We're going to go through all of them. This is kind of weird the way they decided to do this. The codex gives you the health of the squad, but it gives you the and the population cap of the squad, but it gives you, that's the number. Okay, that actually makes more sense. Okay, it's still a little bit strange. The requisition cost is the cost to reinforce 1 unit in that squad, not the cost of the entire squad. And the health is the health of the entire squad, so you divide it by the number here, by that little 4, which is the number of models in that squad. So aggression squad is a 300th health squad with 4 models in it. So each Gretchen then is going to have 75 health. That's how that works out, and each Gretchen costs 12 requisition to reinforce. It's kind of a weird way to do the codex, to do this stuff, but that's what that breaks down to. Okay, a couple other things about Gretchens. Gretchens, like all worker units in this game, are extremely valuable. Gretchens are one of the better worker units in my opinion, probably only second to the Bone Singer, in that Gretchens have first of all, they're their builder unit. Second of all builder units are detectors, which means they see invisible units around them in a radius just passively, which means if you want to stop enemies from scouting you or harassing you with invisible units like snipers or some invisible heroes like the commando, then having Gretchens around is very important. Additionally, Gretchens, like all other builder units, can deploy a beacon, and the beacon sees stealth around them in a certain area. So you can deploy a beacon to a location without having to have the Gretchen over there to also see stealth units, which is very important. And then finally, the Gretchen has stealth of its own. You can activate stealth on a Gretchen to go scouting with him where he's invisible, unless enemies have detectors in the area, which is extremely important. Just FYI. Gretchens have low HP, do almost no damage. They do the minimum amount of damage, 1 DPS. You can use them to tie up other enemies in enemy range squads in melee to make them reduce their damage, but they're not going to last very long because they're very fragile. All right, Gretchens are buildable out of your central starting building. The boys, this is your first basic unit as Orc. It's buildable out of your initial starting building. It's also buildable out of the boys' hut when you decide to build the boys' hut. This is your basic infantry blocker unit, essentially. They have fairly decent HP at 1280 HP for the squad. They're fairly cheap individually. There's 8 of them. What this means, though, is because there's 8 in the squad, which is quite a large squad, it means each individual unit in the squad is fairly low HP, which makes the boys particularly susceptible to AoE attacks and particularly susceptible to line attacks. Any attack that does damage per model, which is pretty much all of the hero AoEs, certainly some of the like artillery style attacks, as well as some of the special unit abilities like Space Marine, Assault Marine Charge, or whatever it's called, where they fly through units and do damage in a line, or the Banshee Nuke where it does damage in a line, the boys are going to be particularly susceptible to, even though they have a lot of health, because their health is spread across a lot of different models. The boys do almost no range damage at all. They do 8 range damage. They have normal armor, and they do pretty light melee damage as well. However, the boys get multiple buffs. Every Orc unit except the Gretchen that loots scrap gets some sort of change to that unit that makes them stronger. The boys gain an increase in health, and their charge not only snares but it also stuns, which is pretty damn good. As well as the fact that the boys have an ability that allows them to channel, where they basically stand still and like psych themselves up, and when they do that they are faster, and I believe I'm not sure if they get additional HP or additional damage, but they're definitely faster. What does it say on there? It doesn't say what those bonuses are, but I'm pretty sure they're faster, and I'm pretty sure they do more damage. Actually, I know they do more damage and are faster. I'm not sure about increased HP. Basically, the boys are a useless early game unit, or a early game unit that only is really good in tying up other units in melee. So most units in this game either are able to shoot at high damage, or they melee at good damage, and they don't often do both. So the boys are very good to just chase around enemy, for example, tactical marines, to prevent them from getting in a position where they can sit there and DPS you, because they're going to be tied up in melee constantly. But other than that, they're not real good. There are a number of upgrades across the course of the game for the boys. The boys are an infantry unit, so all the armory infantry, or the pile of gun infantry upgrades are going to affect them. But there's also some tactical doctrines and stuff like that that can make them better. And of course, they get bonuses from the WA banner just like everybody else. So if you get a successful WAs off, it helps everybody in the Orc army. So I'm not going to mention that too much more. But basically, by themselves, with none of those buffs applied, the boys are extremely weak. Shooter boys. Shooter boys are more fragile versions of the boys that do decent range DPS, but not great range DPS, that upgrade to having a grenade once you picked up scrap. The grenade does fairly good damage. Shooter boys have the same problems as regular boys, though, which are they are extremely susceptible to AoE, even more so because they're even more fragile. Heroes are going to eat these guys alive. Just be aware. Moving on, the Knob. The Knob is a heavy melee infantry unit. It has heavy armor, unlike both the Shooter Boys and the Boys. It still does normal damage, like the Shooter Boys and the Boys, but basically this is a tank unit. It also has a taunt. The taunt is a fairly decent-sized area of effect that forces units to attack it, and I think actually kind of move towards it. I'm not entirely certain about that last bit, but it's been extremely disruptive when I have set up units that to start attacking the Knob and moving towards it. It's really good for coordinating area of effect attacks. So because the Knob kind of holds everybody in place, or at the very least holds them in place, and sometimes actually seems to pull them into it, especially with melee units, it's a very good way to get the opponent to group up. So you can, for example, deploy the Knobs from a truck, so launch them at them, start taunting when they get there. The taunt's a channel. As they're taunting, you can then follow up with additional area of effect attacks, like the Weird Boy nuke, or maybe the truck suicide bomb attack, or whatever the hell it is. Their damage is okay at 107 DPS, but it's not armor piercing. You're not going to be blown away by Knob's damage. Their health is outrageous because it's heavy armor and 3,000 health. There is a lot of it. They're very power intensive. It says 25 there. 25 is not accurate. There are not 25 Knobs in a squad. I don't know why it says 25 there, in fact. That's kind of weird. It's a tooltip error. They're 200, I believe, is the cost to get a Knob, which also doesn't make sense from 50-40, but I'm pretty sure they're 200. But either way, basically there's 4 to 5 Knobs. They're extremely tanky. That's their role. To kill Knobs efficiently, you need to do armor-piercing damage or true damage, because they have heavy armor. And Knobs, believe it or not, don't get infantry upgrades. They get vehicle upgrades. So if you upgrade vehicle attack or vehicle health, that is the upgrade that will apply to the Knobs. Just FYI. Basically, this is your biggest tank unit that is used for disruption and just otherwise making your opponents attack the wrong target. Disruption and to some degree control. If you upgrade the knobs with scrap, they get to throw a choppa. That just they throw an axe at something in a line, it hits the first target, it does more damage based on how far it's traveled, and I think it immobilizes, it says immobilize here, I think it might not, it might actually be a snare as opposed to a total immobilize, but either way, it's not the primary ability of the knobs in my opinion. Tank Buster, one last thing to talk about with knobs. The way that orc availability of units works is it's based on the number of wall banners you have constructed across the course of the game. It doesn't matter how many you actually have alive, so if your wall banners get killed, it doesn't set you back in terms of construction of units, but knobs require that you have built 3 wall banners, a minimum of 3 wall banners across the course of the game before you can build them. They come out of the boys' hut just like the shooter boys and the boys, so if you want to get knobs, you build a boys' hut and then make sure you have 3 wall banners having been constructed across the course of the game. It'll let you summon knobs. Tank Busters. They're deployed out of the Daka hut. They require 3 wall banners before they're deployed. They're fairly squishy at only 840 health. They do almost no range damage, so if you tie them up in melee, they're going to be fairly weak. And they do 31 armor piercing DPS. They are a vehicle counter. They're an infantry-based vehicle counter, which are also highly susceptible to AoEs and hero disruption, so they're not a perfect vehicle counter, be aware of that. And they do additional damage to skimmers, so they are there to counter things like land speeders in the early game, to counter vipers, any of that kind of that vehicle harass that's really popular at tier 2. The Tank Busters are a fairly decent counter to. They get a loot scrap to send a bomb squig that causes damage. I find this to be a lot of micro for not a lot of damage. There is a doctrine that allows you to deploy these mines, which make them a little bit better, but I don't actually think too much about that ability. It seems to get limited utility in my games. Maybe I'll be proven wrong that it's super good, but most of the time I don't care too much about that. It's not one of the super important scrap upgrades. So far, actually, out of these, the boys and the shooter boys are the most important scrap upgrades in my mind. So the stun off the boys charge is really, really good, as is the grenade off the shooter boys. The knob throw isn't that great, nor is the other one. Okay. Def Gun Ludas, these are a very, very powerful orc infantry unit available at... did I say Tank Busters require 3 wall banners? I think I did. Looters require at least 1 wall banner, because it requires 1 wall banner to build the building that they're produced out of. They come out of the Daka hut. They are the equivalent of a heavy bolter. They have a setup time. They have to, when they move to a location, they have to set up before they can shoot. And if they want to leave that location, they have to tear down and then move and then set up again before they can start shooting, which makes them not very mobile, but they have very good range. And if you loot scrap with them, their fire snares. It slows down enemies, which is amazing for a unit of very long range and very high rate of fire like this. They also do damage in a line, so they're extremely powerful versus big stacks of infantry like other orcs, for example, boys charging into them, and they do fairly high DPS at 53 range DPS. It is normal damage, so they're not great versus vehicles, and they're a squad of 4. I don't know why it says 8 here. They're a squad of 4 that have not too much in the way of health. So just be aware when you're using that. They're quite good anti-unit counter. They're susceptible to hero AoEs because they're not very tanky, and they're very hard to move around, so you can't dodge hero AoEs with them, but that's basically what they do. Next up is the truck. This is basically the backbone of the early orc game right now. This is a vehicle available out of the Daka hut. It doesn't build out of the mech shop, which is weird. So it's available out of the first building you're going to build as orc anyways, the Daka hut, right after your wall banners. It requires 2 wall banners up, or 2 wall banners constructed across the course of the game before you can build them. And forget about the transport part. I mean, that's kind of useful, but it's really the second part that's so important on them. They're a low DPS transport vehicle that doesn't have much health, but because it's heavy armor and is available very early in the game, not a lot of stuff does good damage to them in the very early game, so they're actually fairly tanky. And if you loot scrap with the truck, it gives it a temporary shield. Temporary in the fact that the shield can get torn down. The shield actually stays on the truck until it takes damage, so it's not too temporary. And you can loot another shield afterwards when your first shield is destroyed if you want, which makes the truck fairly tanky and fairly persistent across the field until the opponent gets out armor-piercing damage. In the early game, they're quite hard to kill. They don't do shit for DPS. 13 DPS is very, very low. But the abilities it gives you are awesome. You can put squads of melee units or melee heroes into the truck, and you can launch these units fairly decent distance at a okay rate of travel. It's not instant, so it's not like you just target. You do have to lead your opponents a little bit, especially if they're quite far away to hit them. And when it lands, they stun that location in a fairly decent size, not too big, but a little bit of an area of effect. So you don't have to be perfectly accurate with them to still get the stun effect. This is an amazing way to launch melee units at your opponent. It's an amazing way to reach locations you're not able to reach otherwise. And the trucks get a number of upgrades from Tactical Doctrines if you want them, including probably the best Tactical Doctrine upgrade for the Orcs, which gives the truck the ability to launch a bomb out of the truck if it has a guy on board, and the bomb is also a stun, but does area effect damage as well. And there's also another upgrade you can get, which means that units that are launched out of the truck get a shield and also taunt in an area when they land. So what you can do with the truck makes your orc units super mobile. The truck's fairly fast. The truck can be used as a reinforce point once you get that tech out of the armory, which means you can reinforce units around it, which is super helpful. And it allows you to throw units into the fray from locations you wouldn't be able to otherwise. So you don't have to charge into heavy cover. You can just launch a set of boys into heavy cover. You can taunt your opponents, and then you can nuke them with area of effects. It's incredibly powerful. If you haven't played with the orc trucks, you're missing out on probably the strongest tool in the early game orc arsenal. So be aware, this unit is amazing. It also is extremely cheap. It has a high requisition cost but a low power cost, which means you can use them in the early game without running into power issues. You can build 3 or 4 of these if you want and have 3 or 4 you can just put Gretchens in it, so you can still use the nuke ability, and you just roam around with trucks that can sit there and throw AoE stuns that do damage, which is fantastic. All right, the Death Copter. He is a ranged skimmer. He's quite expensive at 100 power and 100 requisition. The power cost is the big deal, of course. He is available, I believe, at 3 pieces of scrap, and he is available out of the mech shop, which is a new building you'll have to build if you want to build him. His loot ability is kind of bad. If you pick up scrap with him, and he then can move forward in a line that does damage, very rapidly move forward in a line that does damage in the line it does, but it's not particularly high damage, and he's a fragile guy. He's only at 450 heavy armor, so he is not particularly vulnerable to regular infantry, but he is quite vulnerable to any sort of ranged armor piercing, like, for example, tank busters or the equivalents. He's a skimmer unit, so he takes additional damage to a number of anti-skimmer units in the game, and it just turns out he's just not very good. He's a supposedly harass unit, an anti-infantry unit. The goal is to perhaps harass resource nodes with him from his high mobility and tough exterior, since he's heavy armor. But he's just not that great at it. He's decidedly worse than the land speeder, in my opinion, although he's much cheaper than the land speeder. And you just don't see orcs doing this very often because they have better available options to them. So probably the weakest. Honestly, I think he's the least used orc unit I have in the orc arsenal, but just still can do it. I've done some land speeder, some Death Copter harasses initially, and it wasn't too bad. All right, moving on. Killer Kane. Killer Kane is awesome, but kind of weirdly awesome. This is a unit that took a minute to realize how good it was. This is going to be available at the mech shop again a little bit later in the game, since it has quite a high power requirement. It requires 3 WA banners, which isn't too many, but it requires 3 to build the mech banner, the mech shop at all. So it's anyways. He has true damage. This is the critical element of this unit. What happens with the Killer Kane is when it's created, it can have up to 3 rocket charges in it, and it will basically, the first time a unit enters range that it sees, if you're attacking with it, if you're just like left clicking or just sitting there stationary, it will deploy all of its rockets at that target. The rockets do true damage, which means they do full damage to buildings, full damage to heroes, full damage to anything that has heavy armor, and full damage to infantry. So it's extremely high damage, and it's extremely high burst damage because it dumps all of its rockets at once. If you loot scrap with a Killer Can, the total number of rockets it has available goes up to from 3 to 6, which doubles its Alpha Strike, and it still launches basically all 6 almost instantaneously. So if a hero darts into view, like a disruption hero like the enemy Farseer, and you have a couple Killer Cans set up, they'll dump rockets on that hero and basically one-shot it. It's beautiful. You can one-shot 9-point elites if you get enough killer cans, which is hilarious. The rockets do recharge very slowly, which means their DPS is quite low. Their alpha strike is quite high. And alpha is really good in player versus player interactions, especially against skirmishing units that kind of dart in and dart out because they get alpha down. Killer cans are good versus all the skirmishing units for exactly that reason. They're good versus heroes en masse. They're good versus the high-level elites en masse. They're good versus buildings. They're just a really strong unit, and they have a ton of doctrine upgrades. You can get doctrine upgrades to give them shield, to give them speed, to give them a additional long-range nuke on an ability that doesn't use rockets but also applies damage in a line at super long ranges. You can get them an upgrade that lets them recharge rockets faster by interacting with an armory. You right-click on an armory, a pile of guns, and they dig out rockets from the pile of guns. They're an awesome unit. And additionally, although they're quite expensive in terms of power and to lesser degree requisition, in the later game as Orc, you can build them out of scrap. So if you don't know this about Orcs, this is an extremely powerful Orc ability that the Orcs get as the game progresses, but not even as the game progresses. The Orcs have this ability all the time. There's 3 sizes of scrap piles: small, medium, and large scrap piles. You can build vehicles out of medium and large scrap piles with Gretchens. You just right-click on the scrap pile, and what it lets you do is it lets you build a damaged vehicle at a reduced cost, and it's a fairly significant reduced cost. As the escalation phases go further into the game, the scrap you generate out of your wall towers move from small scrap piles to medium scrap piles to large scrap piles. And killer cans can be built out of medium scrap piles, which means in the mid-game, you can build a lot of these for a very cheap cost just using the scrap on the battlefield or the scrap out of your wall banners. Killer cans do really good en masse because they get that huge alpha strike at a very good range to anything that approaches them. They're not too tanky. They're low health. They are heavy armor, so they're not particularly vulnerable to infantry, but AoEs will still do fairly good damage to them, and they're a very valuable target to kill with AoEs because they are much better in a large group than they are solo or just a couple of them. Very fun unit to use, very cool unit. I really, really like this unit. If you haven't heard just from how much time I spent on them, definitely check them out if you haven't already. All right, the Death Dread. This unit is another awesome unit. You notice how there's a theme going on with these Orc units? Most of the Orc units are really good. Most of them have really good roles in the game, which is pretty cool. The Death Dread is their big walker unit. He's available from the mech shop. It requires 4 wall banners to summon him. To do that, he's fairly expensive, especially in power, coming in at 225 power. He's very tanky. Not only does he have heavy armor and a lot of health, he also gets an ability when he loots scrap that gives him a shield. The shield increases speed as well as makes him is also a shield. So what it gives him is it makes your walker unit, which are generally slow tanky units, makes him into a fast tanky unit that's even more tanky. He does decent damage. It's 66 armor piercing damage, which is good versus buildings, which is probably one of the few things he'll actually be attacking very often because most people don't want to stand and get hit by a Death Dread, so he tends to run into buildings and things like that and attack those down. But basically he's an enormous tank. He can be built out of, I believe it's large scrap piles, so you won't be able to build him cheaply unless you're using wreckage on the battlefield or it's quite late in the game, but he is very powerful when you do deploy him or deploy those dreads. Definitely check him out, super cool. There's a bunch of upgrades for them in the tactical doctrines as well, and he's an iconic Orc unit, this giant thing with all these buzzsaws coming out of it, running around the field, just rampaging. It's a lot of fun to see and use, and it's quite an effective thing. Just a couple of these in the early to the mid game rather can lead for very, very powerful pushes because it's hard to counter him. He's very tanky and he's heavy armor, so you can find him quite challenging to kill. All right, finally, there's the big track. This requires 5 wall banners and is built out of the mech shop. This is both an artillery piece and a tank. It has 2 modes, the very expensive power, but its first mode is close range, its second mode is long range. Most people use these as long range because they're not super tanky, they don't have a lot of health. Particularly, they're a bit fragile by the stage of the game they're deployed, and they're very expensive, but it does ranged armor piercing damage. If you use it in artillery mode, it also stuns, which is super good. It can make enemies drop it can make them drop the rock or repeatedly stun elites to shut them down. It just causes a lot of disruption at very, very good range. Looting scrap on these isn't that valuable. It allows you to create mines with this ranged attack, but that means the first shot it takes basically after you loot scrap, it loses all of its scrap, so you have to go loot scrap again, which is really inefficient and time consuming and micro intensive, and it's not that good of an ability, but it is something. Basically, this is the Orc artillery. I don't think it's as good as the Space Marine artillery, but I think it's decent. The stun is different and good, and it can be used in a pinch as close range damage, which is fairly high damage DPS, but not that good survivability. And Orc artillery, which is nice to have some sort of long range thing. Although honestly, killer cannons seem to be better at long range than the artillery. This is a moderate. You know, if I had to rate this on power, I'd say this is kind of in the mid range of power as opposed to the high spikes of the killer cannon, the Death Dread. But you will see some of these. You can build these out of large scrap piles later on in the game, and mass are quite good. Having super long range artillery is quite good, especially on 3v3 matches. It's still something you will use from time to time. Okay, guys. Hopefully you enjoyed this, walking through the various Orc units in the game. Get to see them play out, I hope, on your own, and hopefully you enjoy them, and hopefully this information was useful. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed it, please hit the subscribe button, and come check out the rest of my content, and I hope to see you soon. So, thanks for watching. See you later.